This brief Sudanese conquest of Egypt is now very much a forgotten history. The official narrative of Egypt underplayed the Kushite disruption, blandly calling the reign of the Kushite kings the 25th dynasty, thus quietly incorporating them into an unbroken story of an eternal Egypt. But Kush's historical role is now being energetically reassessed, and Sudanese history, in some measure, rewritten. In the British Museum, we have a curator who has been central to this work of recovery and re-evaluation. Derek Welsby, a leading expert on the archaeology of the Sudan, has been digging along the Nile for many years. He's done a lot of work at Kawa, north of Khartoum, where this sphinx came from. It was made to go into a temple there that had been restored by Taharqo. Derek's description of the working conditions at his excavation give an idea of what this land would have been like for the Kushites.
Often it's incredibly hot on site. Even in the middle of winter it can be very hot, but sometimes early in the morning it's incredibly cold as well. It's like 4 or 5 degrees and then you've got a very strong wind. But by 11 o'clock it can be 35, 40 degrees, so it changes very dramatically. The temple that Taharqo built at Kawa is purely Egyptian in design. It was actually built by Egyptian workmen and architects sent by Taharqo from his capital at Memphis in Lower Egypt. But it was built in the heart of Kush. But the Egyptian influences are just a veneer over Kushite culture. The indigenous African culture continued right the way through the Kushite period. It used to be considered that the Kushites were just slavishly borrowing things from Egypt and just copying Egyptian models. But what we see, they're picking and choosing. They're choosing the things that are enhancing their view of the world, the status of their ruler and so on. And they're retaining many of their local cultural elements as well. And you see this particularly in the religion, because not only do you get the Egyptian gods like Amun, but you also get the major local Kushite gods such as Apedemak being worshipped sometimes in the same temples.
As originally placed in the temple, Taharqo's Sphinx would have been seen only by the ruler and by his closest circle, which would have included priests and officials from both Egypt and Kush. Coming upon it in an inner sanctuary, Kushites would have been reassured by its black African features, while Egyptians would have immediately felt at home with its peculiarly Egyptian iconography. Taharqo's Sphinx is a very sophisticated piece of political imagery, for it's not just a mix of north and south, it also combines the present with the long distant past. The form of the lion's mane and his ears closely resemble elements found in ancient Egyptian sphinxes as far back as the 12th dynasty. That's about 1,000 years before this. The message is clear. This black pharaoh, Taharqo, stands in a long line of great Egyptian rulers who have held dominion over all the lands of the Nile. Taharqo was eager to expand Egypt beyond Sinai and its northeast border, an aggressive policy that led to conflict with the Assyrian king Sennacherib, whose stone reliefs were the subject of the last programme. Around 700 BC, Taharqo allied himself with Hezekiah, king of Judah, and fought alongside him. But this challenge to the Assyrian war machine ultimately led to Taharqo's downfall. 10 years later, the Assyrians came looking for him, seeking the colossal wealth of Egypt. And although he repelled them that time, they soon returned. In 671 BC, they forced Taharqo to flee south to his native Kush. He lost his wife and his son to the enemy, and after more attacks from the Assyrians, he was finally expelled. In the long history of Egypt, Kushite rule was a brief interlude of not even 150 years. Yet it reminds us that the border between what is now Egypt and Sudan is a constant fault line, both geographic and political, that has frequently divided the peoples of the Nile Valley and frequently been fought over. We'll see that fault line again later in these programmes, because both the Roman and the British empires bloodily revisited this contested boundary between Egypt and Kush. Geography has determined that this will always be a frontier, because it's here that the first cataract breaks up the Nile into small rocky channels that are very hard to navigate, making contact between north and south highly problematic. For Africans, the Nile has never been just an Egyptian river, and it's claimed as fiercely by the Sudanese now as it was in the time of Taharqo. The Sudanese-born political commentator, Zainab Badawi.
Ideologically, I wouldn't say that there are any huge differences between the Sudanese and the Egyptian government, certainly, and there is a huge affinity between the people. I think that the biggest source of friction and potential tension between Egypt and Sudan has been in the Nile and how the waters of the Nile are used. The feeling that a lot of northern Sudanese might have is that the Nile actually, in a sense, runs obviously much more through Sudan than it does through Egypt. Sudan is the biggest country in Africa. It's the 10th biggest in the world, the size of Western Europe. It is the land of the Nile. And maybe there is a kind of slightly brotherly kind of resentment by the northern Sudanese that the Egyptians have, in a sense, kind of claimed the Nile as their own, whereas the Sudanese, in a sense, feel that they are the proper custodians of the Nile because, after all, most of its journey is through the territory of Sudan.
Zainab Badawi's words perhaps make it clear why the union of Egypt and Sudan just under 3,000 years ago was easier to achieve in the sculptured form of Taharqo's Sphinx than in the unstable world of practical politics. Recovering the story of Kush has been one of the great achievements of recent archaeology, showing how an energetic people on the edge of a great empire were able to conquer it and appropriate its traditions. It's a familiar pattern in the story of empires, and it's one that was taking place somewhere else at almost exactly the same time. In China. And that's where we'll be going in the next programme. You can see this object in close-up and browse hundreds more at the A History of the World website. Go to bbc.co.uk/A History of the World.